Welcome to the BSc Hate Crime Network podcast, where we aim to understand and respond to hate against marginalised communities. Your hosts today are Dr Rachel Keighley, the Deputy Chair of the Network, and Dr Irene Zempi, the Chair of the Network. Today's guests are Professor Stephen MacDonald, Professor Catherine Donovan, and Dr John Clayton, who won the 2022 Article Prize Award for their paper, I May Be Left With No Choice But to End My Torment, Disability and Intersectionalities of Hate Crime. So to start, can you please provide us with a brief overview of the paper? So in terms of what you've examined, so that's the topic, your research aims, and a bit about your research methods.
Yeah, hi, Rachel. Sure. I'll just take you through those. So the paper, this specific paper, focuses on the experiences of hate for disabled people in particular. And part of the basis of that is that this group's experiences of hate are fairly unconsidered relative to other protected characteristics within the literature, within the criminological literature, within the hate studies literature more widely. And part of our argument is really to warn against the kind of unitary and siloed approaches to understanding hate crime, which we suggest in the paper might conceal intersections with other marginalised identities. And so this is particularly the case when disability is not recorded as a hate incident or a hate crime. It's not recorded as the basis for that incident, so it often gets concealed. So that's part of what we're trying to argue in the paper. But we're also looking at hate beyond kind of singular, isolated incidents. We're trying to kind of connect those incidents and trying to think about experiences of hate as more akin to a kind of hate relationship, and that's the concept that we draw upon, which is a concept that we've developed in previous work. So we're looking at hate not as an isolated set of incidents, but as a kind of ongoing relationship, but also looking at experiences of hate for disabled people beyond this concept of mate crime as well. So that's exploitation by those people that are familiar to someone who's being targeted in this way. So looking at kind of in between kind of hate crime and mate crime really is this idea of hate relationships. And this is an idea that we developed in previous work and previous publications and previous research to try and capture the nature and character of repeat reports of hate crime. So to try and understand and make sense of those repeat reports, which make up quite a considerable kind of proportion of overall reports of hate incidents and hate crimes. And we're particularly looking at hate relationships to understand those experiences over a longer term of hate as directed by neighbours and by those living locally to victim survivors of hate. And in that kind of conceptual work around hate relationships, we draw parallels with work in the domestic abuse literature around coercive control. So the sort of character of hate relationships is that they are often low level. They can escalate, and maybe talk about that later. They're enduring. They take place over a considerable amount of time, and I think we'll talk about that later as well. And there are kind of impacts, quite considerable impacts to mental health, well-being, and to kind of physical health. And also kind of impacts on mobility and freedom and independence as well. So there's a kind of parallel there with the literature on coercive control that we kind of draw upon to make sense of this idea of hate relationships. So the research aim of the kind of broader project that we were looking at, so that's the kind of, I suppose, the focus of what we look at in this paper, but the kind of broader research aim of the project was to consider this character of repeat reporting of hate incidents, and whether this concept of hate relationships helped to make sense of these experiences across the intersection of protected characteristics. So that's the kind of aim of the research more broadly. In this paper, as I've said, kind of delves into the experiences of disabled people in particular. In terms of methods, we've been working over quite a long period of time now with a regional, when I say regional, I mean the northeast of England, an advocacy organisation in the northeast of England who provide a hate crime advocacy service. We've got a really kind of excellent working relationship with that advocacy organisation. They do some incredible work around their hate crime service. And people are referred to this service or are self-referred to this service through several routes. And often where other support services and kind of help-seeking routes have kind of failed to address their concerns and failed to address the nature of these hate relationships, these kind of repeat reports over a considerable period of time. In some situations, individuals and families have been living with these hate relationships for years, and the interventions have failed to address them sufficiently. So the advocacy organisation kindly gave us access to their case notes from the meetings between their advocates and their clients or the people using their services. And these are redacted case notes, recordings of meetings between advocates and clients from the start of their service, which was 2017 through to 2019. So that was 149 clients were referred during that period, and 148 were accepted. What we did then was kind of look at the kind of the criteria for how we defined hate relationships. That was repetitive incidents generated by the same perpetrators over a considerable period of time, and suggestive elements of coercive control, and filtered those cases down to a number of 50. For the purposes of that kind of met that criteria of being what we would regard as a hate relationship. For the purposes of this paper in particular, we then filtered down again to identify any of those who were either disabled or were living with kind of physical health issues or mental health issues. And 67% of those 50 cases were affected by disability prior to the hate relationship, and 33% received a diagnosis of a mental health condition following these incidents. So that's kind of formed the basis of the kind of thematic analysis that we did of those case studies. That's sort of those 33 cases.
That's excellent. As you point out in the paper, hate studies have predominantly focused on racist or homophobic crimes rather than the victimization of disabled people. Why does disability hate crime remain invisible in research terms?
I think in terms of research terms, I think disability is invisible, not just within hate studies, but across criminology and allied disciplines. I think that in relation to disability is often conceptualized as a health issue. So criminology in particular have not picked up issues of disability and have not constructed disabled people as a minority category and a minority group, unlike other allied subjects such as sociology, for instance. So in relation to how gender and race was overlooked in criminology, the same thing has happened to disability. So if we look across criminological research, in a sense, disability only appears in the forensic work in terms of it's pathologized and it's individualized. And actually, in terms of within sociology, theories of disability has had a significant impact. So you've had the disability movement, which emerged from the 1970s onwards. Out of the disability movement from grassroots politics, you had a new way of looking at disability. Hence, disability was something which was constructed within the environment, within the attitudes of society. So there's a structural element to disability. And what we see emerging out of this understanding of disability is disability theory. So you have the emergence of a structural approach to disability. So you have realist disability studies, you have post-structural and critical disability studies, and you have the traditional, in a sense, disability studies was underpinned by a Marxist approach. But although, in a sense, since the 1970s, we see the emergence of disability theory within sociology, in a sense that hasn't, in a sense, been picked up within criminology until recently. And it's really within hate studies where people have started recognizing disability, and we suddenly start seeing the focus on disability and victimization. And it's actually within hate studies where we start to see the first attempt to really theorize disability within criminology. However, I wouldn't say that's necessarily happened within criminology per se. It's very much happened within disability studies. So out of the disability movement, we've seen the emergence of disability studies. So actually some of the most important studies have really developed within disability within disability studies. So what really influenced our research was, obviously in terms of different theoretical approaches which we applied to our research, but also, the research by Catherine Cornbury, Mark Sherry, which very much looked at the relationship between hate crime and disability. Also in terms of some of the stuff around mate crime, Pam Thomas highlighted in terms of specific forms of hate crime, which manifests itself in terms of from a relationship perspective and a coercive control perspective in terms of hate crime through friendships. Our own research, which very much looked at, and another research project where we looked at violence within care homes, and also in terms of research by Al Ralston, which very much critiques the pathologization of disability around vulnerability. Hence, in terms of the idea that vulnerability is linked to somebody's pathology rather than structurally produced. So I think that criminology and research is just starting to recognize disability, and it's just starting to move away from actually disability is just something which appears within health to disabled people or a minority population which are isolated, discriminated, and marginalized in the same way as other protected characteristics and other communities which we deal with.
I think that's a brilliant answer, and I think something that your article quite critically argues for is an intersectional approach to hate crime. So how is it that you define and understand intersectionality, and why is it important to employ this intersectionality in hate studies?
The reason that we got together, the three of us, to work on hate was because we were, so Steve is an expert in disability studies, John is an expert in race and ethnicity, and I have expertise in sexuality and transgender identities. We weren't looking at hate, but those were our areas. So when we came together, we've always worked intersectionally because we bring those lenses with us, just as a way of working. And I've just really gained a lot by working with John and Steve and doing that. So our approach is, I suppose, it's informed by Kimberly Crenshaw's work, that that kind of, that people's identities are not additive, but they're simultaneously being lived through lenses that overlap and are being perceived through lenses that are simultaneously overlapping. And that's what we've tried to do in our work, is to try and keep on remembering that people are have multiple identities, and that we want to remember and contribute from each other's fields of expertise to have a more holistic approach to what we're researching. But when we looked at the data, we were just, I mean, this is particular kind of data, as John has explained. So we didn't collect any primary data. What we negotiated was with the project was for redacted case notes, so anonymized case notes. So what we're really analysing is the hate crime advocates' client notes. And what we realised as we were looking at the data was that they were absolutely recording where people's experiences, the impacts of living in these hate relationships, was impacting on their social lives and their mental and physical health as well. And disability was just in the background very often as part of either a consequence of the hate relationship that they were living with because their mental health was deteriorating, or in fact their physical health, that they were developing chronic health conditions as a result of living with the hate relationship that they were in, or they were just talking about, so one that really sticks in my mind is of a client who it was recorded that it was race hate, but what they were talking about was the way that the neighbour was blocking their access to their backyard to get to the mobility scooter. So, and nobody's talked about disability as being part of the hate, but clearly it is part of the hate, because they know that the perpetrators know that the mobility scooter is in the shed, and they are actively preventing them from getting access to it. So in a way, the intersectionality was just speaking out at us from the data. And what we've been trying to work with the project is about how to try to flag that. I mean, because the criminal justice system approach doesn't do that, does it? It doesn't allow for an intersectional approach. You've got race hate, you've got disability hate, you've got sexuality hate. So we're really at the moment trying to work with them to try to find ways that they can raise the visibility of, typically it's disability that is the characteristic that is in the background, and it is either race or faith or sexuality that is the recorded reason for the hate crime. So I suppose, I don't know if that's a very roundabout way of saying that. That's how we've come to the research, and that's how we've approached the analysis of the data, by keeping these intersectional hats simultaneously on.
Absolutely. And I think, in terms, if you don't mind just jumping in relation to when we first started researching in this field, quite a long time ago now, well, we started looking at, in terms of, we came together, but we were really interested in what was different about different forms of hate. So what was unique about race and faith? What was unique about homophobia and transphobia forms of hate? And what was unique about disableist hate? So, in terms of we can see that in what we sometimes refer to as the first wave of research, which actually very much highlights, in terms of violence in care homes, exploitative friendships, the pathologization of victims, and also in terms of poor, arrests and prosecution rates of disabled populations and other populations. So we very much started looking at what was different, but what we noticed was that there was lots of intersectionality within there, which wasn't really being captured. And there was lots of similarities rather than differences. So what we see in terms of is maybe the second wave, what we're very much looking at is in terms of rather what is different, what is the same. And that's what really led into our approach around intersectionality, and what really led into this project as well.
I think this is excellent. And indeed, the key strength of this work is the intersectional focus. And I would really encourage other hate crime researchers and academics to employ this approach. Otherwise, one cannot do justice to people's experiences. So completely agree with everything you said. Moving forward, you also note in your paper about the concept of mate crime, and this is a key term that has emerged when examining the exploitative relationships between perpetrators and disabled victims' survivors. How do you define mate crime, and how does it affect victims' survivors? Especially for the benefit of our students, but also practitioners or people who are not maybe familiar with the term.
Right. Right, I will try to simplify and be brief in terms of, so I suppose in terms of this paper, actually, and our other papers, in a sense, engages in both hate crime and hate incidents, in mate crime, because we've just finished a pilot on cuckooing, home takeovers, which engages in a form of mate crime, but goes beyond that. And also what we engage in is hate relationships, what was central to this paper as well. And we see three as being distinct. So in relation, if we use disability as an example, in a sense, someone getting on a bus who might, somebody from the disabled community who's getting on a bus or getting around town, and they might be targeted multiple times by different people who are engaging in forms of hate speech, hate incidents, or even in terms of forms of violence, which could be considered and meet the threshold of crime. So in a sense, they might experience these incidents and crimes multiple times in one day, but they are from different people, and these incidents are solely relate to their the fact that they are a disabled person and their impairment. Then in relation to mate crime, in a sense, there's a relationship which is formed between the perpetrator and the victim, and that's what's different in terms of, so somebody will will develop a friendship with the sole reason to exploit. So this is, in a sense, an interaction which happens over a period of weeks, months, and even years. So the friendship is hateful. That this friendship is targeting somebody because they have an impairment, usually because structurally they're isolated, and they have poor social connectivity. So they're offering friendship. But part of that, there's a coercive control element to that friendship. And the sole reason is to exploit them for money, sometimes exploit them for fun, and to exploit them to do something. And within our research, we see a form of exploitation happening, which actually is to take over the home. So many disabled people living in communities, in certain communities which have poor social connectivity, in a sense, although they don't have access to many things which can be taken off them, in a sense, the home is a commodity which can be used to exploit. So maid crime is a relationship which actually the perpetrator is trying to get access to money, a home, or in a sense develop other relationships of exploitation. So it's a longitudinal relationship. So that's maid crime. So there's a relationship formed, and sometimes disabled people don't necessarily even notice that this is an exploitative relationship. So there's similarities between domestic violence and an abusive relationship, which is formed through maid crime. In relation to our hate relationship definition, now a relationship is formed, so it's different from, but it's different from maid crime, because this relationship isn't formed through a friendship, or the relationship isn't formed with the sole reason to exploit. This relationship is formed because the person living in a community is seen as other, is not belonging to that community. So often this is a member of the community living close to them, and sometimes a neighbour living underneath them or next to them. So there's a relationship formed, and what we see is a continuation of forms of hate. Often these are low level. Sometimes they develop and reach the threshold of crime and develop into more violent forms of interaction. But most of the time, this is about blocking driveways. This is about playing loud music. This is about banging on doors. This is about low-level forms of intimidation. So there's a relationship created between the perpetrator and often the disabled person, but it's not for the sole reason to exploit. It's for the sole reason to get this person removed from their communities. And often, as what we'll pick up later on, that's exactly what happens in terms of once services step in, then usually the outcome is that the person is removed from that particular situation. So the victim is removed, so the victim is punished by moved into a new environment, and the perpetrator is rewarded. So what we see in terms of these three different forms of hate, we've got the classic definition in terms of hate crime and hate incidents. We've got maid crime, where relationships are formed to exploit, and then hate relationships is where a relationship is formed for the sole reason of, in a sense, a removal of the person from a particular community. So there's no friendship involved in our definition of hate relationships. I hope that has been clear, and I'm not sure if somebody wants to come in on that.
Yeah, no, I think the only thing I would add is to just emphasize that with maid crime, the person being victimized, they're very ambivalent about the perpetrator. So they might actually get something out of the relationship, even if it's only companionship, even if that is coercive. So there's much more ambivalence about their sense of the relationship being harmful. Whereas with the hate relationship, it's absolutely clear that it's harmful. There isn't any doubt about it. It's only about who will listen to them and who will recognize and agree that what is happening should be stopped and that they should be supported.
And as I'm sure we'll come on to, that is one of the major issues with this, is that early intervention, that early recognition of those hate relationships taking form it's not acknowledged by those people who need to acknowledge it and can help to bring an end or to reduce the kind of escalation of those experiences.
I think this sort of your conception of perpetrators was actually something that really stood out for me in terms of the paper, in having that distinction between different types of perpetrators. You know, we talk a lot in the hate crime world about the different natures of hate crime and the different impacts it has, but very little about how the different motivations and natures of perpetrators. So I think that's something you really nailed down quite well. And there's obviously other key themes that emerge from your analysis and your understanding of your research within the paper. So I'd like to, if we can, briefly explore these. So the first one being the key finding of disability as a hidden factor when we're recording hate incidents and hate crimes.
I think that goes back to intersectionality in terms of what we noted when we first started doing this and looking at in terms of hate, which was disableist in nature, in a sense, was, you know, a very small category compared to race and faith, and even at that point in time in terms of homophobia and transphobia, but in terms of the hidden nature. Well, when I first sort of started looking at the analysis of this first project and a project which we're currently working on, in terms of, again, one of the smallest categories was disableist hate within this. But then when I started looking through the case notes and the narratives of the practitioners and the victims and survivors within our research, what I noted was that actually often it wasn't in hate relationships just one individual. Sometimes it's one individual, but it's often families targeted. Now, in terms of within these families, often there was a disabled person. And actually, although there was a record of disableist hate, some of which Catherine's already made reference to, in terms of some of the hate wasn't necessarily disableist in nature. It was racist or it was homophobic. But actually, the interplay between disability and other characteristics and other identities, it was almost that in terms of criminal justice agencies, but also social services, in terms of social workers, care managers, housing, in a sense, was just looking at the racial element and not really picking up that these people were also disabled as well. And disability was having an impact. So Catherine's already highlighted one example in terms of racially motivated hate, where actually the neighbour was preventing the mother from getting out in the garden, which was imprisoning her in her own home. But there's another example in relation to which really springs to mind, which is about homophobic hate, which I think we refer to in the paper as well, where we had a young man who was experiencing homophobic hate both in his community, but also by carers within his own home. And he was reporting this to the care manager, and he also reported this to the police. But because he had a learning disability, his voice was completely ignored. So, you know, the manager said, there's no way my staff would engage in homophobic hate. So in terms of, and she said, you know, he's always making things up. Actually, when this was reported to the police said, yep, actually, we do think he's experienced homophobic hate, but, you know, it's going to be too difficult to actually collect evidence and prosecute based on. So the interplay between having a learning disability, being what's seen as a reliable witness, and being believed was central to that form of homophobic hate. So it wasn't that disability just wasn't being recorded, it was the impact and the structural nature of disability what was preventing people being listened to by both practitioners, criminal justice practitioners, and in a sense, and other practitioners in relation to social work, social care, and in relation to and housing. And that's one example, and we see multiple examples both in this project and the project. I've been recently, you know, analysing the interviews of a follow-up project to this, and we can also see this highlighted by practitioners. And actually, I've also heard when we presented this this research to practitioners, in a sense, I've heard similar narratives, stigmatized narratives that, in a sense, yeah, okay, this person's saying that, but is it actually true? So there's a question mark which wouldn't be there if the person wasn't from a neurodivergent or a disabled community. So in a sense, it's all about the voices, and actually, unfortunately, disability often leads to disabled people's voices not being listened to within services. So I think that's central between the interplay, and that is, it's not just about recording the data, it's the impact what disability has, and by not acknowledging that, then this has a significant impact on many of our participants who are disabled.
And related to that, as a barrier to understanding people's experiences, you alluded to before that criminal justice agencies record and understand hate crimes and hate incidents as one of, simply cases. But one of the themes in your paper is hate as a long-term relationship. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so that goes back to what we were looking at in the original research that we did, is that we were looking at a third party reporting agency and their data, and it was really clear that there was a significant minority that were reporting repeat incidents. And so that's why we started to think about what is going on there, what is happening when and also the type of things that were being reported were the types of activities, the types of victimization that don't necessarily meet the threshold for a crime. So, and my background is in domestic abuse. So I was thinking, this is making me think about coercive control. And so with the next project that we did, we identified 3 criteria, which was, is there record of repeat reported? Does the perpetrator or perpetrators live near the person being victimized? And are the impacts like coercive control? And when you look at the impacts for coercive control, they can be short term, but quite often they're cumulative over the longer term. So it can have cumulative impacts for your physical and mental health, but also for your social well-being. So you become isolated. And a lot of the people's case notes talked about feeling trapped, entrapped, and people who experience domestic abuse and coercive control talk about feeling entrapped. And so what we started to realize in the case notes is that because the nature of the experiences of the victimization is often either too low level to meet the threshold for a crime and or too difficult to evidence. So it might actually be a crime, but you can't collect the evidence. So having things thrown at your windows, having things in your front yard or your backyard being destroyed, letting a dog come in and crap all over your flower bed. So kind of destroying your stuff, putting a mark down your car paint, not letting you park your car where you wanted to. These are things that if you just report them as incidents, police are going, what do you want us to do about it? What do you want? Who did it? Prove it. So, but when you can see it, if you look at it as a coercive controlling relationship, then you see that these incidents are connected and they have a cumulative long-term impact on the people being victimized. But also because they're not being picked up early, they're being dismissed as too low level or not a crime. And then what happens is that the relationship goes on and on and on until such a time as something like a GP gives them a letter to give them more points so that they can be moved. That seems to be the majority way in which these kinds of relationships are being resolved, is to move them away.
You also covered my question about the impact, so thank you so much.
The other thing to just add to what Catherine said there is she's talked about the issue of time, the longevity of these relationships and how that's cumulative and how that becomes unbearable and overwhelming for a lot of individuals and families over that time. But also the kind of proximities involved, the questions of space, I think are really, really significant as well. So this sort of inescapability of it, inability to kind of be away from that, the way in which the home is kind of as a refuge is kind of undermined, because a lot of this hate, is outside the front door, but also infiltrates the home space as well through loud music, through banging, through stuff being thrown, through infiltration into garden spaces, and so on and so forth. So actually the inability to escape, because it's targeting the home and because it's targeting that home space, which we, conventionally think of as a safe space, as a kind of space of security. Actually, I think that also kind of adds another dimension to the seriousness of this, but also the unpredictability of it, not knowing when it's going to happen and what that might be that happens. Kind of the variety of different forms of harassment and violence we've talked about, shows you the kind of range of possible tactics that people employ, the perpetrators employ. They're not knowing what's going to be next or who's going to be next or what's going to happen next. That sort of prospect, I think we write somewhere in one of our articles, I've got a prospect of violence is actually really, really damaging.
So the periods of quiet can't be enjoyed because actually you're vigilant about when is the next thing going to happen.
And we also see behavior change within the home, people staying away from windows, people walking quietly around the house because they're worried about the downstairs neighbor or the neighbor next to them will hear, and this will start the incidents off again. Not going out in the garden, especially in terms of the disableist forms of hate which were reported, in terms of often this took place outside in their gardens. So the gardens become a key target, so they can't go out with their children. So the whole family is affected. So we see a complete behavior change in a place which should be safe within the home. So hate penetrates the walls of people's houses.
And I guess it becomes like a prison.
Mm-hmm. Many participants actually said that.
I feel like a prisoner in my own home.
Yeah.
Which I think is a really powerful statement, isn't it, to the experiences that they're having. And I know that you spoke, Catherine, a little bit about some of the impacts of these hate incidents and hate crimes that they're experiencing. But your final theme that really emerged from the analysis of this paper was the hate incidents and hate crimes effects on health. So can you speak to a little bit to those, if that's possible?
Yes, briefly in terms of just about that point, in terms of we think about, when we were looking at the data, when we talk about the 50 cases, now what we noted was 66% of them cases related to some form of disability, although the hate wasn't necessarily motivated around disability. 66%, disability was involved. So that's a significant number of cases. Out of that 66%, 33%, when these cases started, these incidents started, they, in a sense, wouldn't have been categorized in a disability group. So in terms of experiencing long-term hate, we saw having a direct impact on people's health. So remember, in terms of some of these cases, go on for months and years. So we had one woman talking about experiencing racially motivated hate since she had moved to the Northeast, what was something like 30 years previous. But actually, it had really become, it was only since the death of her husband where it had really stepped up a notch and she was really being targeted. And within her case, she was an older lady. During one of these incidents, she had went to the shop and she was being targeted by a group of people outside of a well-known supermarket. The security guards noted that and actually walked her home. And as she was being walked home, she had a heart attack. And that had an impact on her long-term health. But that's one example. But we saw multiple examples of people developing long-term health conditions. So strokes was quite common. Heart attacks were quite common. Other health conditions. And then when you include mental health, in terms of we see post-traumatic stress disorder. I think we might even have referenced in terms of this example in the paper with a trans woman who had been targeted for years through different hate relationships, and she ended up getting stabbed, and that obviously had a direct impact on her mental health, and she had post-traumatic stress. But it was quite commonplace that people would develop long-term mental health issues because of being entrapped within these long-term hate relationships. So I think that the complexity around disability, many people had a disability before these hate relationships were started, and that was part of the dynamics which led to the hate relationships development. But also some of our participants very much developed and then will be categorized as a disabled person because of the hate relationships. So there's that interplay between health and disability in relation to hate as well. And we see professionals recognizing this. So we see GPs, noticing this and writing to other services, highlighting the impact this was having on their health or the impact it was having on their long-term condition.
I think it's clearly a public health issue. And it's promising that GPs are recognizing that, but it does remain hidden for other social agencies or criminal justice agencies. I also think that for those people who have multiple disabilities, it might make matters even worse. You conclude the paper by suggesting that to develop an effective hate crime intervention, criminal justice agencies, social services must consider the possibility of the hate relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. I know we spoke a little bit about that, but if you could also comment, why do you think that this is necessary?
I think it's really important that the practitioners who are involved, so mostly that's the police and or a victim support service of some kind, and or if they get referred to them by the police, and or housing and or antisocial behaviour teams. So they don't work very well together. I don't think the evidence would suggest from our research. Nobody takes responsibility for it unless it's a crime. But you have to go a long way to be able to get that as a crime, and then the police are clearly in charge of it. So I think what we're trying to say is, if they were able to understand the impact of what they perceive to be low level, if they could see the impact of that on the people who report it and their families, including their children, some of whom start to get frightened to go out to school, not because of what's happening in school, but because of the journey to school and the journey back home from school to their front door, that if they could understand the impacts of those low level, the cumulative impact, and dealt with it and recognized it earlier, that might make a huge difference for the people being victimized. I mean, the other thing that we would like to see happen, but there doesn't seem to be anything that happens at the moment, is working with the perpetrators. What seems to happen is that everybody wishes the victims would go away somehow. If they can manage to get help to move, brilliant, that solves the problem. And but nobody speaks to the perpetrators other than the police sometimes, if they take the case on, or if they're asked to respond. But very often we've got cases where the police are trying to mediate. So they're not seeing the impact, and they're not seeing the hate, and they're not seeing the impact of the cumulative hate. So what we're trying to do is create a toolkit that would A, help people identify what's happening earlier, and B, provide a model of practice that brings those key partners together more quickly to share information, to talk about the risk and the need of the people involved, and to better provide support for the victim survivors, but also to start the conversation about what should be done with the perpetrators.
And I think it's just to pick up on Catherine's first point, especially in relation to how services aren't working together, in terms of what we see within this study and the study what we're currently conducting, is that in terms of victim survivors are reporting to agencies, getting passed to another agency, telling exactly the same story to that agency. Information isn't being passed on, sometimes seeing another person from the same agency, and then they don't seem to have any knowledge of what is happening to them, and then it's often conceptualized as low level. So there doesn't seem to be much joined up thinking. When we presented this data, both, not just to criminal justice agencies and conferences, but also social work conferences, people often say, well, this is just safeguarding. But actually what we notice in our research is social workers, especially adult social workers, seem to be absent. So it might be safeguarding, but we don't see any evidence that safeguarding is happening. And we don't see any evidence where, in a sense, there's any form of joined up thinking which is emerging. So actually, we sort of know what the solution is. We need multi-agency joined up thinking and interventions. The police can't handle this on their own. We need, in a sense, a multi-agency approach. We know this is the answer, but at this point in time, it is not. And there is a constant focus on in terms of moving the victim. So, okay, once it's recognized, then what we will do is move the victim. But that is rewarding the perpetrator. And that's not always the case if we think about antisocial behavior. We see, in a sense, a focus on collecting evidence to move the perpetrators. That is not the case for hate. The easiest option is to move the victim. And that's really what we found. And that's what both in this study and the study what we're conducting at this point in time, that's really what we're finding. Actually, let's move the victim. That's the quickest and easiest way. And sometimes the victims, although don't want to be moved, but after this has went on for 6 months, a year, 2 years, then they've been, in a sense, run down. So eventually they say, yeah, okay, let's move. And it's them who's moved out of the community.
And even if there is a desire to move, even if that is the kind of immediate kind of reaction from those who are being victimized, it takes a certain level of evidence, again, to give them the priority to be able to move house. It doesn't just happen automatically. That itself is can be a long-winded process too. But just to pick up on the kind of partnership working point that Steve raised, I think one of the best models that we've found for kind of bringing together different partners is actually through the advocacy organisation itself.
I was going to say that, John, because we don't know of any other part of Britain that has this advocacy, a hate crime advocacy service. So they act as a sort of key worker, and they act with and on behalf of the victimized people and their families, and they go to each of the partners and they do bring them together and they get much better resolution. But yeah, they're kind of doing amazing work. And that's the other thing we'd like to do next, is to try and prove that, evaluate their service so that we can offer it as a best practice model for other parts of the country.
I think there's also a level of trust that's built up as well, because the advocate gets to know the individual and the families, it gets to understand their circumstances and the sort of longitudinal temporality of it, the fact that it's been drawn out over so many years and that they haven't been listened to before, they haven't been taken seriously necessarily, that the isolated incidents haven't been joined up in any meaningful way, and that the interventions have been inadequate. So I think, yeah, it does certainly provide a kind of a starting point for some kind of model for partnership working, I think, and should be more widely, those ideas should be more widely disseminated and more widely practiced, I think, across the country.
Yeah, I think they're really important issues and I guess outcomes that you are setting and laying the groundwork to address these issues. Is there anything else that you feel needs to be done to address not just the issue of disability and the intersectional nature of hate crime, but just hate crime and hate incidents and hate crime more general?
I think what I'd say is, this is a kind of a longer term, broader, grander vision, I suppose. But I think we need to understand the kind of contextual nature of these situations. We need to understand under what circumstances, under what conditions do people turn to these kind of behaviours and be forced into these kinds of living conditions. Mm-hmm. So socioeconomic context is absolutely crucial. Political context is absolutely crucial. But all that, how that manifests in different ways in different kinds of geographical locations as well. But obviously that's a kind of bigger picture aim and a grander mission. But I think we have to recognise it, that what does it take to create communities which don't allow for these kind of behaviours to take hold and are not put up with. And yeah, that's a complex form of resolution, but I think it has to be a kind of aim.
Yeah. And we are trying to build that in terms of our more recent project, which is trying to build a toolkit for practitioners. In a sense, we are trying not just looking at multi-agency working, and I say not just because that's complex in its own right, but also how can we bring communities in, because we get lots of evidence that members of the communities don't want this to happen. So how, in a sense, can we tie in communities to try to make their communities more safe and to tie into a form of preventative measures around hate within their local communities?
That's excellent. Thank you so much for your fantastic contributions to today's podcast and an excellent paper. I think it's like an exemplar that I would like to use and suggest to my PhD students, my students generally, hate crime researchers. I think so many key strengths: intersectionality, the long-term relationship, many of the themes that you unpacked today. That's that from me. Rachel, would you like to add anything before we bring it to a close?
I think just again, so thank you for such a fantastic piece of research and a fantastic paper. I think, like you've already mentioned a lot today, we focus on the more visible, in inverted commas, strands of hate crime, the ones that get a lot of attention, both within the criminal justice system and within hate crime studies in general. But I think it's really important that this research is bringing to light these more marginalised communities and really unpacking the issue in a way that we all should be doing within our research. So yeah, thank you very much for today.
Oh, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Great to talk about it.
Yeah, it is. And thank you very much for inviting us to talk about it.